Our speakers for today's call have been fantastic to work with, and I'm so excited to welcome them into today's conversation. Our speakers today include Sarah Vogel, who is an SAFSF member and the author of The Farmer's Lawyer, which you will hear more about today. It's a fantastic book, and I encourage you all to get a copy and learn more about what Sarah will be sharing today. Sarah will be joined in conversation with Carolyn Mugar and Glenda Yoder of SAFSF member Farm Aid, along with Stephen Carpenter of Farmers Legal Action Group. I'm going to pass it over to Carolyn now, who will be guiding us through today's conversation. Carolyn?
Hello. Actually, Farm Aid is on land all across the country. So for us to say what lands we're on would be presumptuous, since I also don't want to get into it, the huge list that everybody else can participate in. So thank you, by the way, SAFSF, for doing this for us, because it really is an opportunity for us to gather together and talk about what is so important to us at Farm Aid and people on the land. And it's been a real pleasure reconnecting. Of course, we stayed in touch with both Sarah and Stephen this whole time. So I'm going to quickly introduce Sarah, who's almost impossible to introduce. If you haven't read her book, it's a thriller, it's scintillating, and it's not at all, it doesn't have a category. You just have to read it. It's an extraordinary book, but it shows the necessity for amazing detail that needs to be gone into to actually protect people and be on the land with people. So I really encourage you to get the book if you don't have it already. And Sarah Vogel, we've known each other for, I think it is 35 years now. And I would love to introduce you to please start.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. And I'm like so grateful for the support I've gotten over many years, and all farmers have gotten for many years from Farm Aid. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm on the land of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes, as well as the Lakota, Dakota, and the other Sioux bands. When I wrote the book, I featured a Arikara Native American couple who were farming land for thousands of years, and I'll get to that also in a moment. I wrote The Farmer's Lawyer because and it deals with the 1980s and the farm foreclosure crisis of the 1980s, but it's not going to be, it wasn't the only farm foreclosure crisis. There were others in the past, and one that was very influential for me was the 1930s, which hit North Dakota very hard. And in North Dakota, we had our own political party called the Nonpartisan League, which I grew up with, which was a religion in my family. And the Nonpartisan League fought against the waves and waves of foreclosures that were going on in the 1930s. So when I returned to North Dakota after a career, I went to NYU Law, and I came back to North Dakota after like a 10-year career out on the East Coast. I started hearing from farmers who were facing foreclosure again. And it was like a button in me was pushed, all the NPL stories that I had grown up with about foreclosure moratoria and stopping foreclosures and laws to protect farmers. And the purpose of politicians was to protect farmers. All those buttons got pushed. And I first started helping one farmer and then another and then another. And the book, the title of the book is The Farmer's Lawyer, and it's apostrophe S, the North Dakota 9 and the fight to save the family farm. And I used the farmer apostrophe S on purpose because when I started working with them, it was farmer by farmer by farmer, individuals. They weren't statistics, they weren't assemblages, they weren't groups. They were all individuals, and as I worked with more and more of them, I saw that they had similar things were happening to them that happened to many others. So and they were it was all happening at the hands of a federal agency that was supposed to be helping them, an agency that had been set up in the depths of the Great Depression, which was the 1930s by FDR and agencies that were established at the time to stop the great farm depression of that time. But under the wrong leadership, those laws that had been created to set up and help farmers were turned to basically starve them out and force them from the land. And I found 9 very brave individuals. 4 of them were women, 5 were men, and they were my lead plaintiffs. And they were the North Dakota 9. And the way they got that name is I didn't even realize it, but long after the case was over, I talked to the judge, Judge Van Sickle, who was the lead judge in this case called Coleman versus Block. I'm jumping ahead of myself, but Judge Van Sickle said that during the case, he started to call them the North Dakota 9 because they reminded him of the Chicago 7. And if you knew these North Dakota 9, I mean, they were just plain spoken people from the countryside. None of them had a suit. Maybe they had a suit, but they were saving it for their funeral. And they were just plain people. And totally unlike the razzmatazz and the exhibitionism of the Chicago 7. But Judge Van Sickle thought that they were standing up for civil rights in the very same way as the Chicago 7. And I must say that Judge Van Sickle was a wonderful, wonderful judge for us. But so that the book deals a lot with the North Dakota 9 and the stories of those farmers. I said 4 of them were women, which are women farmers are often forgotten, and I think they should not be forgotten. So the book deals a lot with the 1930s and the legacy of the 1930s, and going up through the development of the case, all of the appeals that we went through where constitutional rights were being deprived. And eventually I realized that we needed to do a lawsuit, and it needed to be a class action. And that is the impetus for the call that we're on all on today with an audience of foundation and funders. And that's because when none of my farmers, they didn't have enough money to pay their telephone bills. They didn't have enough money to pay me. They didn't have enough money for food. They didn't have enough money for medicine. And they certainly could not have funded a lawsuit of the type that needed to be done. And the farm organizations of the time were strapped also, and they were fighting battles in Congress, trying to get better farm programs or influence politicians to make the federal government, which was the Reagan administration, by the way, back off. And that's when I thought of doing a class action and the need for funding. And so and I'd like to read a little segment. This is after I had been working on this for quite a while, and it was pretty grim. But I thought that what we needed was, oh, I should also mention this came about after the farmers tried to raise money themselves by holding a big shindig, a big, we called it the Family Farm Legal Assistance Project, or FLAP And we had, they had an Oompa band and free beer and charged $5, and we raised $271 after like tons of effort. And so it was obvious at this point that we needed help from outside. So I put together a funding proposal for this FLAP organization. And we wanted to file lawsuits. And so I asked for $200,000 for a legal defense fund that would provide legal services to farmers facing foreclosure and also allow me to bring a series of state level cases in North Dakota and other states, like the Curry case in Georgia, as well as cases to force FMHA to comply with due process and give farmers fair hearings and force them to pay attorney's fees when farmers win those appeals. Legal defense for these family farmers is urgently needed if the United States wishes to avoid a massive hemorrhage in the numbers of small family farmers, the backbone of the rural economy, I wrote. Under a very feasible scenario, the FMHA, which was the agency of the Reagan administration, was doing all this. The FMHA drive to reduce delinquencies could have the impact of setting in motion or accelerating a chain reaction of farm foreclosures, small business bankruptcies, and massive rural dislocation. I sent it off to Chicago. And I sent it off to an organization that Mark Ritchie, who is, I believe, on the phone call today. Mark Ritchie knew stuff that I didn't know, and he knew of foundations. So he had located a foundation called the J. Roderick MacArthur Foundation. And I sent it to them. And then I got a call back several weeks later, and it was, and this is also from the book. This is Lance Lindblom. I'm the executive director of the J. Roderick MacArthur Foundation. I gripped the receiver. If he was calling me on the phone, I thought it had to be good news about the $200,000 grant I'd applied for. We're interested in your proposal, Lance said. You are? We'd love to help, but we were wondering, what would you do if you had $15,000? And I had to scale back my ambitions, but I said, I'd bring a class action here in North Dakota. And that's what I did. But I would not have done it without that promise of $15,000 from the J. Roderick MacArthur Foundation. And I think, and as soon as I heard the money was coming, I immediately, moved into a real office out of my house, and I lost my office, got locked on my office like just a couple months later. But in the meantime, I'd set in motion this case, and the support from the J. Roderick MacArthur, and they doubled it, by the way, to 30,000 when we moved it into a national class action. But for that $15,000 investment in this case in North Dakota to save family farmers from foreclosure, the case would not have been filed. We would not have received the results that we did. And the results were pretty phenomenal. We filed the case in May of '83, and we filed it earlier than that, but in May of '83, we got our first preliminary injunction, and that stopped foreclosures in North Dakota, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of foreclosures going on in North Dakota in a class of 8,200 people. And then by the fall, we expanded it to a national class action. And by the following year, in 1984, we had a preliminary injunction that protected 245,000 farmers from foreclosure. And they were, not all of them were delinquent by any means, but there were 50% of the farmers at the time were running delinquent. And there were 16,000 cases in court. And some states didn't even require FMHA to go to court. They could just start a foreclosure by paperwork. So it had a huge, huge impact. And over the years, I've always reflected on what would have happened but for that grant from the J. Roderick MacArthur Foundation. I think it would have been, certainly a worse result. And corporations would have been gobbling up farmland. Many, many family farmers would have lost their land, and towns would have gone.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second because I want to ask a question here I wanted to, if you would talk about the importance of, in this case, it was Mark Ritchie, who we all know, anybody in the farm movement has touched base with Mark, and Mark has touched their hearts and their work. But the importance of having other people that were aware of other opportunities.
Yes,
and also people on the ground. And there's a few other organizations that at various points in the book you mentioned. Now, I'm not talking about Farm Aid, I'm talking about some of the folks in Iowa and Nebraska.
There was an organization in Iowa that they were Danny Levitas and Dave Ostendorf. They were, at first they were called Rural America Iowa, and then they became, help me with the name, Prairie Fire, which was a name. And then they, and when the case was going on, there were, I think, 3 or 4 organizations. Mark was one in the rural America. I can't remember the name exactly, but I would send them to Mark. I would send them to Dan and Dave. I'd send them to the Center for Rural Affairs in Iowa, and then that network went out to farmers, and they were able to reach people. And the communication on my part was impossible with this huge class, and we were just a small law firm. And we did have help from other lawyers, either, by the time we filed the case, including the National ACLU, bless them, and and then Alan Cantor, great class action lawyer, who was then out of Philadelphia, and that is now in New Orleans. But communication was impossible without these grassroots farm organizations. So I would send packets of the pleadings to this 3 or 4 groups, and they would in turn fan it out. And those organizations were absolutely instrumental and still are today. And they also are the ones who send the information upstream, saying, here's a pattern, here's a practice, here's a law that's being violated, here's something to do. And the normal situation is that people first try to deal with it on their own. They may contact politicians. In my case, the farmers I worked with, one of them in particular, Randy and Lois Oster, who are on the cover of this with me, they had written to everybody. They had a stack of letters written to the president, to the head of USDA. They wrote to Jesse Helms. They wrote to everybody, and the letters they got back were form letters. So a lot of times people don't have political power, even if they try to exercise it. And the way that they can do it is through groups that have advocacy arms. And that's one of the areas where I think Farm Aid has been so instrumental over the years, is by supporting these grassroots groups.
Well, so the reason I asked the question was, trying to get in, emphasizing the importance of these groups today, and many, many more, and so many groups that are almost invisible to the average public, and yet they are playing such an important role on the ground, keeping people informed with real information and being able to provide them with real support in the way that's needed, such as all the many ways that FLAG can support people. So we'll get into some of this later.
Yeah, and so the audience of grantors, I hope, will be aware of that. The
web.
It's a network.
Yeah.
a web. I always called them, just vaguely, I called them the good guys. You know, there was a category of the good guys, and there was a category of the bad guys. And the good guys were the little farm groups and the farmers and the network of lawyers that were helping them. And then the bad guys were the ones trying to take away their land and deprive them of the very means of existence. So, but I think I just wanted to emphasize too to the funders on this call that when they get a grant application from one of these groups, it may not look fancy, but it will be from the heart. And we'll be talking about real issues. So do not reject those. Please, for help when they come in, because they may be inartfully written, and they may not have the balance sheet of the nonprofit. But in my case, when I wrote to the J. Roder and MacArthur Foundation, and Lance Lindblom called back and he said, "What would you do with $15,000?" I said, "I'd file a lawsuit." And he said, "Okay, we have to give it. We can't just give it to you. We're a foundation. We have to give it to a nonprofit organization." So, and I, of course, was, I was certainly a nonprofit, but not with a capital N or capital P nonprofit. I was just poor. I called up Mark, and Mark said, "Oh yeah, sure. I've got a couple nonprofits." And so the grant did not come to me. It went to Mark. I say to Mark, but it went to one of Mark's nonprofits, and then it was handled in that way. But it took the grassroots leader, the organization, and then it funneled on to me and the clients I was dealing with, who belong to their churches, for example. But they may, the Crow's Hearts belong to their tribe, but none of them were tightly connected to farm organizations, other than the Falmers, who were active Farm Bureau members, but the Farm Bureau did not come to help us at that point. So I do hope you read the book, and at the very end of the book, it's kind of funny because the book is about 400 pages long, but the whole purpose of the book is to carry this one paragraph. And I hope this book will sow seeds for a future agriculture system that is based on human needs and human values. The people who can grow that system are on farms in the countryside right now, and they have city counterparts who are pioneering new methods of urban agriculture. They need our support. They are America's family farmers. And so that's one of the reasons why I joined the Sustainable Agriculture and Food System Funders Network, is to carry on that work that I started so long ago, because I was so inspired by the family farmers who are trying to grow food for all the rest of us, and take care of the soil and take care of the trees and the future generations. I was so inspired by them then and now. And I think this is really an urgent time for us. And we can get all masked by, like, there's a war, so prices go up, or there's a drought. But I think if you do a deep dive past the big statistics, you'll find that there are many, many, many thousands of people out on the land who are wondering, how will I make it to next year? And this is why Farm Aid has been here throughout, since the 80s. And this is why so many of the groups are there. And I think that the lessons of the 1980s and since then have been that grants for legal purposes and for family farm organizations are extremely important in the survival of the family farm. I don't know how long I've been talking. Long enough?
I think that's a perfect transition, Sarah.
Yeah, okay.
And I think that we can welcome, thank you so much for sharing your reflections. We'll have some more time for folks to ask you questions later in the conversation. And for now, let's go ahead and welcome Carolyn and Glenda into the conversation to share a little bit more about the legacy of the grant and this instrumental case.
Go ahead, Glenda.
Hi, everybody. I'm Glenda, and I'm here in Boston on the native lands of the Massachusetts people. I just wanted to say a little bit about Farm Aid and how much it's an honor to be here in the presence, particularly of Sarah, who has achieved so much, thanks to a little help from her friends. Yeah. So I just wanted to say, how does Farm Aid know about the urgency and the need for legal support for farmers and farm organizations? And one of our most important ways of knowing what we know is our Farm Aid hotline, which is 1-800-FARM-AID, and also an email portal on our and in our website. But it's been operative for 36 years, and it's a referral and resource line staffed by caring and knowledgeable people. It's an open portal to farmers, and we've learned that, without a doubt, that credit and legal support, if given in a timely way, can make a difference in keeping farmers on their land. And so that's why Farm Aid has been dedicated to keeping that portal open. About 7% of our 589 cases in 2021 were for legal and mediation services. The other way that Farm Aid really knows what's going on is that we've been grant making since 1985, from the height of the farm crisis, which Sarah so accurately describes. Farm Aid recognized early on that legal funding would be necessary to give farm groups and farmers the full range of resources they needed. There are two perennial legal service organizations that Farm Aid has funded and really believes in, and one of them is, of course, Farmers Legal Action Group. Obviously, Stephen's here, and he's going to let you know about the full range of services that they provide. Another group is North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers Land Loss Prevention Project. It's led by Savvy Horn, and from their website, it says they provide robust legal representation, technical assistance, and policy advocacy. They were founded to curtail the epidemic losses of Black-owned farmland in North Carolina and elsewhere. And I would urge you to look into their work. It's really important work. Also, Farm Aid makes what we call strategic grants, which are sort of outside of our cycle. And I wanted to tell you about a current example of an out-of-cycle grant that Farm Aid recently made to Land Stewardship Project in Minnesota, responding to the legal needs of their organization. We are really pleased that they reached out to us to tell us about the situation, and Farm Aid was able to respond immediately. I can tell you, though, that they have not yet raised the full cost, the full amount they need for their legal campaign. But we've often seen that rural communities that are resisting CAFOs and CAFO expansions have often needed legal expertise to enforce or maintain local control. We think LSP, Land Stewardship Project, is a seasoned group that consistently and brilliantly organizes on a variety of issues. So there's a lot of trust there. They're currently in an organizing effort in Winona County, Minnesota, supporting local residents against the expansion of a dairy CAFO. This case also has certain particulars that make it a bellwether for other issues, including the very foundation of democracy and the right of people to organize. But since 2018, this group called the Daily Farm has been attempting to expand its operation to more than 4 times the county's existing animal unit cap, a move that the community feels would endanger their water supply and the livelihoods of their farmers. The County Board of Adjustments has denied this factory farm request twice for the variance, but the Daily Farm has filed an appeal to the Minnesota Court of Appeals, claiming that LSP's organizing and public education efforts constitute bias on the part of the County Board of Adjustments. And this kind of legal action subverts the democratic process and forces an industrial model of agriculture on a people that don't want it. And it really could affect the future of rural communities and their capacity to stand up to these kinds of efforts. It isn't bias for people to organize, and it isn't bias to stand up for the quality of the water and the soil. We're really proud to support this effort and really hope that this legal challenge can preserve the fundamentals of democracy with the help of funders. They have produced a couple of videos, but I chose their 2-minute video. And Susie, would you mind playing that one? And it'll tell us a little bit more about what the county residents are saying.
Hello, I'm Karen Ahrens.
I'm Richard Ahrens. I'm on a home farm here in Lewiston, Minnesota. I've lived here for 74 years.
I've lived in Winona for 52 years.
I have lived in Winona County for over 30 years. I am a health coach.
I'm an elementary math tutor.
I came to Winona to work for Watkins Products as a chemist.
I farmed all my life. I farmed while I was teaching school. I farmed while I was going to college. I farmed as long as I can remember. And growing up in a rural community where not too far away is a trout stream, it's pretty hard to keep the boy on the farm when you can go grab a pole and a mile away catch trout. So I hope my grandkids can fish in that same stream I did. And it means an awful lot to me to be able to keep the farm going as my previous generations have done.
When I first learned about factory farming, it just puts a pit in my stomach. The effects that come from factory farms, impacting water, air, the economy. There's so many other negative effects that go along with it. In all of the years that I've lived in this area, it's very evident how many farms have gone out of business. The thing that concerns me the most is water.
When we have these large factory farms that spread large amounts of manure and fertilizer on the ground, it can percolate down through this particularly porous karst geology into the groundwater, which is used by many local residents for their drinking water.
I grew up and my parents still deal with the effects of impaired drinking water systems.
We have a well right out here in the yard, and I grew up with that well. It was the sweetest tasting water you ever had. My mother used it for canning, cooking, and everything. It was wonderful. Now it's high in nitrates.
For our health and for our appliances and for a number of reasons, we went to bottled water for drinking water.
It's not right. We should be able to have potable water coming out of that tap. I don't know what's going to happen if the factory farms add to this pollution. Where's it going to end? Where's it going to end?
Yeah. I think we can see how important voices from rural America are and how important it is to hear those voices and for organizations to be present to deal with those people and to connect them with each other so that they can feel strong and protected also. And Farm Aid, when it came into existence in 1985, was very fortunate to come across a state organization, Farmers Legal Action Group, and we were very lucky with a grant to help it go national. And Stephen Carpenter is a warrior on the phone right now, on the webinar, sorry. And I'd love you all to meet him. And Stephen, I'd like you to talk about how FLAG operates, how important it is right now in terms of protecting people's rights, in terms of going into the minutia that nobody else cares about and taking it right up to a policy level so that it's embedded in practice for everybody to be able to access into the future.
Hello there. Thank you. It's really a privilege to be with everybody. I sit as we speak on the land of the Osage people in what's now Western Missouri. So as I am really thrilled that there is such a thing as sustainable ag funders, as I think, you know, everybody who's ever worked in a nonprofit or tried to help with nonprofits, you have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with funders. And it's really wonderful to have this sort of an organization and an effort to really understand the issues. And I say that as somebody who, in frustration, has at times said, why are we doing a report? Can't we just say we're still fighting the man? And everybody looks at me like, you know, please stop, you know. But we have really important things to talk about. And what I want to really address with you folks is that in the struggle to sort of save an egalitarian and just agriculture, and we won't have a just food system without a just farming system, and we won't have a just society without a just food system. It's all interlinked. And I want to talk a little bit about the way that lawyers can have a role. And I want to say, first off, you know, lawyers are not the key to everything. You know, that would only be lawyers that think that. But lawyers can have a role, and we really need to support the grassroots farm organizations that are fighting to have a just agriculture. And I think, you know, what I want to try to emphasize to you is that lawyers can have a role in that. So let's just do a brief snapshot of kind of what's going on in agriculture now. Super, super simple. Let's talk for a second about the way lawyers can operate to help the grassroots farm organizations, and maybe two quick examples of the sort of work that FLAG has done. So we're Farmers Legal Action Group. We're actually based in Minnesota, and we're a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers. So if I was to just say a super quick snapshot, I would remind you that there are still 2 million farms out there in this country, that they are extremely unequal in terms of their resources. It's really kind of like the rest of the country, except even more so. There are very, very large farms doing very well. There are a lot of people in the middle, and there are people that really, really struggle. And those that struggle don't really have any sort of opportunity for actual legal assistance. I mean, I have a lot of friends that are farm lawyers, and I'll just say straight out, they work for people who have money and that can pay them. And so it's a short list of folks that are trying to do really good legal work as a nonprofit and to help folks that are struggling. Land loss prevention was just mentioned. Farm Commons, there are others, and they are really working hard to help these grassroots organizations fight the man, you know, have a better and just society. The issues out there are really not all that dissimilar in some ways than when Sarah started off in the 80s. You have dispossession, there is discrimination. I hopefully don't need to tell you that although the stereotype is that every farmer is a white man, we know that's not true, and it's never been true. But there are a lot of forces in this society that discriminate and make sure that there's not an equal opportunity out there. And you know, there's again, I mean, that's a really good example of a thing that lawyers can work on. We have unfair contracts we have unfair and bizarre governmental policies and implementation of potentially good governmental programs. We have a credit shortage. in almost, in every one of those sort of that litany of problems, there is a legal angle. And the point that I would hope to emphasize is that there's a way to leverage lawyering. And that is to use grassroots farm organizations, to use lay advocates. And lawyers who are thoughtful and work hard can write materials that now, with webinars, thousands of people can see. They can help grassroots farm organizations develop policies, develop litigation. The point, I think, the crucial point is leverage. Take the skills that are there and use it to maximize the effect that's possible. And that's what Sarah did. I mean, and even, Sarah didn't even touch on the extent to which grassroots farm organizations relied on her work and picked up where she left off and went out and got the word out. It would have been impossible for Sarah to implement her own lawsuit. It was people working hard with their neighbors to make sure those foreclosures didn't happen. A court can only do so much, and then everybody has to pick up the slack. So I would hope that, as we think about just agricultural societies, we would rely on grassroots farm organizations that are doing the good work, and we would notice that there's a role for lawyers there. I thought I would just give a couple of examples of the sort of thing that we've done at FLAG in the last couple of years to sort of give you a sense of what's possible. So nobody saw COVID coming, of course, and it hit everybody hard, rural and urban. And by the way, don't forget, we've got a lot of urban farms, a lot of struggling urban farms. When you go to your farmer's market, I can just tell you, there's a decent chance the person that hands you that bag of tomatoes lives in or near poverty. That is not a way people get rich. People are struggling out there, even the ones that you see face to face at a farmer's market. So COVID hits agriculture hard. Some people do okay, and you guys are ag funders. If you had a CSA, a community supported agriculture, some of those folks did fine. But let's suppose you had a contract with a school district to give fresh fruits and vegetables to kids. School shut down. The school district just says, sorry, we don't need anything you have to offer, goodbye. And people were in a total free fall economically. It turned out, those are legal problems, and there's a way to talk about them and think about them. There also turned out to be a number of programs that aim to help everybody through COVID. And actually, some of those programs, there's a really important one from USDA. I'm just going to tell you, it was super confusing. We wrote a guide to how to understand the programs and how to use them, and did webinars, and some of them sponsored by Farm Aid. Even more confusing and difficult was the Treasury Department, who knows a lot about farming, and the Small Business Administration, which knows even less about agriculture, created what was commonly known as the PPP program. And unbeknownst sometimes, I think, even to the people that wrote the program, this applied to people who were self-employed. And everybody thinks, okay, sure, all these gig economy people driving around, other people around, that's who we meant to help. But actually, it applied to farmers too. But it was super confusing and very, I'm sorry, but poorly written and developed. But we figured it out, and we helped grassroots organizations, for example, convince the Treasury Department that you can't require tax Schedule C tax forms if you're going to help farmers, because nobody uses them. It's a Schedule F. And so with a sort of advocacy and by grassroots organizations and with a bit of legal background, we were able to get the word out. And it kind of shocks me. I am told that our COVID guides were downloaded more than 30,000 times. And these are just a plain out farmer's guide to COVID relief. And that's a way I would like to think, we were able to leverage our expertise. A second quick example is that I'll just talk for a second here about something that you may have heard about. It's made the newspaper a little bit. It's the American Relief Protection Act, and it's sort of part of the COVID relief stuff. But what it did was something very interesting. It, for the first time, said all right, we know that there's been discrimination against people of color for as long as we've had these programs. We're going to do something about it affirmatively now. We're going to forgive or pay off the debts of 14,000 people who are farmers of color. They're technically known as socially disadvantaged farmers. It's sort of an odd wording, but that's what it was. And then, and this was going to really be a huge boost to thousands of people who are struggling hard to make a living farming and aren't white. So naturally, it being America in 2020, some lawyers and white farmers filed a lawsuit that shut the program down. And so here is our situation. We have people trying to fight back to save the program. That's a legal problem. But actually, more profoundly, you have a group of people, thousands of them. They all have loans with the government to try to farm. They are told, we will forgive your loans. Then you turn around and a few months later, they read that it's been completely suspended by the courts. Now what? You have all this debt. You don't know whether you're going to have to pay it or not. It is a nightmare. And so a task that we are taking up and that many other organizations, I could name several, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Intertribal Agriculture Council, real hardworking, excellent groups are trying to figure out what people's rights are. And we're going to write about it. And we're going to write about it in ways that we hope will be understandable. We're going to be working with the Rural Coalition, another organization you should support, to try to help people understand their own rights. And so that everyday folks can figure out what's happening to them and what to do next. And so again, it doesn't take an army of lawyers to do that, but it takes some support. And so I know I appreciate everything that Sustainable Ag Funders have done for us and for other organizations. And it's really an honor to be here with Farm Aid and with Sarah and all of you folks. And I believe that's my little piece of ranting for the moment. I will turn it back to others.
Well, if I may just comment, Stephen, thank you so much. You know what confidence Farm Aid has in FLAG, and also how much we know that your work needs to be magnified. And so I just want to reemphasize the importance of the ability of this legal work to be extended to lay advocates as well, who can distribute this information and who can, when people come to them, can know when they might need legal support and legal help. So there's that fine moment of understanding that there is something that can be done, and that how to refer people to the right resources and the right information. And FLAG has those resources and is armed with those people and those extraordinary amount of booklets that you've done and trainings. I went on the FLAG website wanting to print out the name of all the booklets, and it was like 4 pages of, this gibberish that I couldn't understand at all. But I dearly would love a name of all the guides that FLAG has written. And we've often been fortunate to be able to be part of those trainings, because those guides without trainings sometimes have less value than they could. And those trainings are for those grassroots groups out there who are on the ground using their fingertips to reach people, and also using their ears to hear people. Because as Glenda pointed out, so much of what we feel that those people and the Farm Aid Hotline is really the canary in the mine, that they find out what trends are that are happening that we most need to be overseeing and warning people about, and warning FLAG about, quite frankly. So that's just a comment in the middle of this. And I think there's going to be a question and answer period now, and Susie will oversee that.
Yes, so we'd like to invite you all into conversation with our wonderful speakers, who we're so grateful that they've shared some of their stories, some of their time with us today. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute. Or if you're not on video, you can either type into the chat unmute yourself. The floor is open now.
I'd like to hear from, I have a question to people I don't know, but I know you're there. I'd love to know what your main interests are. And I will make a comment that before it's a question with, I guess, a comment hidden. And that is, for a long time at Farm Aid, we've known that we have to do two things at once. We have to fight off the corporate ag presence, such as Daly's milk operation in Minnesota that Glenda introduced Land Stewardship Project with that video and the harm that's being done. We have to fight that off, and we have to make sure that people on the ground there have every bit of protection that they possibly can have. And we also have to be creating new systems that we want to have available to magnify and use as not only models, but as active examples of what people can do and how we can flourish, and how the countryside, the land, the water, the farms, the people can flourish. So there's that knowledge of that contradiction that we live with all the time, of having to do those two things at once. And I also want to comment that I know it's been a terrible day of grief for people, what happened in Texas. And what I return to at moments like that, when I might not be able to do anything directly related to that, is I return to the fact that we are so fortunate to know these wealth of valuable people that are on the ground, sprinkled across the country, who are doing the work that they're doing. They are providing people with real information, not false information, but real information. And I know, Sarah, your book deals a lot with the posse comitatus in the 80s and how dangerous that was. And the misinformation spread now has picked up right where the posse comitatus left off. And this is all in Sarah's book. And Stephen, I know you're extremely familiar with that also, and Glenda. So I just want to say, I think a real wealth of possibility is in strengthening these groups and being in touch with them, because that is where real information can get disseminated, can get heard and used by real people that are out there dealing day to day. And for those folks on from Land Stewardship, we are so grateful to you for doing the daily work that you do, as we are with so many of the other groups that we're lucky to know about and support.
Thanks, Carolyn. I see that Lori has a question. Lori, I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
It's not so much a legal question as a political one, but I'm hoping that some folks here could speak to this. I'm wondering how effective it is when there are efforts to have people writing into their representatives, their senators about issues, you know, that they want, these folks want to hear from us. And when we write in, especially with these kind of automated letters that you just kind of copy and paste, if any sense of how much weight that carries?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I hope the other panelists and the audience will kick in. But what I found in the 80s is that when these farmers who are suffering distress wrote to, say, Jesse Helms or Senator Andrews or whomever, their front office sent the letter that the farmer sent to the senator and turned around and sent it back to the person that the farmer was complaining about, who then got very mad at the farmer even more and retaliated. So I told my farmers not to write. I mean, that's the way it was. I mean, I hated to be harsh, but you know, there's a role for, and then writing to the agency, put you on the kook list or whatever. But so I tried to be the intermediary as a lawyer for those farmers and point out to the senators or the congressmen that laws were being violated, the Constitution was being violated, or, to be in between the farmer and the agency. But back then, and that's where the farm organizations, the small farm organizations, come in very strong, because then they can write, and it can't be pinned on any one farmer who's complaining. Of course, that was under the Reagan administration for the most part, and they were just vicious. So that was my take on it back then. So sometimes and I'm not saying that does, like I certainly think during the pandemic, all the letters to Congress probably did spur on, those laws that were adopted that were, very, very important. But sometimes the legislative branch wrote a law that didn't, that wasn't implemented. For example, the right to apply for deferral. The agency disregarded it, and then the courts were necessary. So I think various issues have various responses, but that's kind of my take, and I will step back because I'm still traumatized. Later on, when I was a politician, I was the commissioner of agriculture. I used to write a letter to those guys, because that's who they were. Like I wrote more letters to politicians and to agency administrators because they could not retaliate against me. I was an independently elected agriculture commissioner, and so what if they didn't like me? But I did not. I tried to protect the individuals who were complaining to me from potential retaliation.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's go to Jolene and then to Bob, as both of you have questions for Stephen. Jolene, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I know that Stephen responded in the chat. I thought it'd be valuable information for everyone.
I work with a network of farmers here in Hawaii, and a lot of people sort of just jumped into the PPP loans, not really maybe understanding that it wasn't just free money that they might not have to pay back. And then I just think we're kind of far out west, and we don't get we don't have good farm aid services like from the state, from the Department of Agriculture out here. And so I guess I'm getting a little worried that a lot of these farmers are going to be expected to pay back the money and won't really have the same kind of notice and support that they need.
Thanks, Jolene. Before you answer, Stephen, let's go to Bob to have you unmute and ask your question. You're still on.
There we go.
There you
go. Stephen, thanks for name checking Farm Commons. We made that original grant and have funded them last 7 or 8 years, similar to the first grant that Sarah talked about. I think it was $10,000 and really got Rachel up and running. But my question really is, in addition to Farm Commons, are there other probably more regional legal firms, nonprofit legal firms that work in this field? And if so, is there a directory of them? Is there a resource center where we can provide donations or facilitate others to make those kind of gifts?
So I would, to answer Jolene's question first, I think it is the right thing to be worried about how all that COVID relief will actually play out over the medium and long term. And unfortunately, there is not like a single answer. Oh, you're going to have to pay this back, or you're not going to have to pay it back. It depends on the loan, the circumstance, the sort of things that you did. For the PPP stuff, it is the case that people overwhelmingly, you're going to get to keep that money. So I'll put again a link to our website in the chat, and we have, I always say this just to warn people, a dry as dust guide to PPP and EIDL loans. And they are long, and if you like footnotes, you are in for a treat, because every assertion has the authority that we use to sort of reach that conclusion. And we really worked hard to try to anticipate the sorts of problems that people would have where they might have to pay it back, what that look like, when does it happen. So if you would my suggestion would be to take a peek at those. If you continue to have questions, I'd be happy to talk to you, and we'd be if whatever organizations you're working with, we'd be happy if there are further questions and it makes sense to do a little webinar, whatever would be helpful. I wish there was sort of a super simple answer, but there's not. And my sense is Hawaii is, that you couldn't be more correct. It's just even more isolated and adrift in terms of information. We see that as well with the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. I don't know what to say except it's true. So yeah, please feel free to follow up. So the second question, and I'm sorry, that was Bob. Yes. So Bob, it is something of a short list. We mentioned Land Loss Prevention Project. We mentioned Farm Commons. What I can tell you as well is that there are really good organizations that have hired a lawyer or two. And so if you wanted to support legal efforts directly, for example, I know that the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is a really terrific organization in the Southeast, that they have at least a couple of lawyers on staff, and there are others as well. And one of the things that I have tended to think that is a good answer for funders is fund the organizations, the grassroots farm organizations, and they can contract or agree with or direct funds to the lawyers that they want to work with. Yep. And they know who they can trust and deal with. And if I knew 5 more organizations that were similar, akin to Land Loss or Flag or Farm Commons, I would name them. And I'm mortified thinking I've forgotten somebody, but there's really not a long list of folks out there, I'm sorry to say.
This is Sarah. I would add, there are some law firms around, like the law firm that succeeded my law firm, which now called the Broughton Law Firm. They pretty much focus only on working with farmers. So they have that expertise. Nowadays, it's also in North Dakota, a lot of environmental work, not just food, but there are law firms that do that too. But of course, they have payroll and fees and tech that they have to pay for. So it's not. I tried totally nonprofit law practice. Luckily, my father bailed me out. There's a lot of financial woes in my book. So it's not easy being a lawyer, and I think many lawyers are willing to do a modicum of free pro bono work, but when it comes to the big cases, it's the case that probably funders will have to step in. And again, as in my case, they couldn't give me the money. They gave it through a grassroots organization. It can be done.
Stephen, do you want to talk about farm advocates and the role that they can play in this picture?
Sure. So as I tried to emphasize, there's really a shortage of folks that will do the legal work to help everyday farmers. And so one of the brilliant things that just sort of erupted in the countryside is everyday people calling themselves advocates. They're not lawyers, but they learn about legal issues and other issues, and they help each other. And those began in the 80s. They continue on in some form. In Minnesota, there's actually a small but fantastic state-funded program, Minnesota Farm Advocates, and there are a few of those sprinkled around in other places. And so these are folks that generally are farmers. They know, they know their neighbors and they know their neighbors' problems. And so they can get some basic training and have some basic backup and then help people that are in difficult circumstances. And so, for example, the Minnesota Farm Advocates do a lot of work with people who are facing foreclosures and repossessions. And they'll help people with mediations. They'll help people figure out if a bankruptcy is appropriate and maybe refer them to a bankruptcy lawyer. And at FLAG, it has always been a super important priority to support those farm advocates. I mean, I'm just going to say this, even though, I mean, I'm sort of joking, but then again, not really. These folks don't have law licenses, but they have knowledge. And so in America, we have a licensing system for lawyers. And so I have sometimes thought, I'm kind of not doing my job if I'm not coming within 1 inch of assisting someone in the unauthorized practice of law, because there just are not enough lawyers. And here you have people that want to learn and want to help each other. And boy, I'm willing to do pretty much anything I can to help them in that task. And I think as ad funders, that's something that you should consider as well.
Thanks, Stephen. We're coming up on our 15-minute mark. So I thought to close, it might be nice to go around and have you each end with one final thought that you'd like to impart on our funder audience today. Let's start with you, Stephen, and we'll go backwards.
Yikes. Well, I really, really appreciate the extent to which the philanthropy world has taken an interest in food and farming over the last couple of decades. I remember when it really wasn't the case. It's a super great thing. Keep it up, and let's get some good work done. Thank you.
Let's go to you next, Glenda.
Thank you, everybody, for being so engaged. It's really great to be here. I would say I always am impressed by groups that are organizing and they locate the legal strategy within a larger strategy of social change. And I think farm groups, what do I know, but I think they are more adept perhaps than any other sector at utilizing well the legal support that they can get. We know there's a shortage of lawyers in rural America, and yet look at the heroes we've got represented here with Sarah and Stephen. And so I am really impressed at on the ground organizing that can utilize legal strategy.
Thanks, Glenda. How about you next, Carolyn?
I want to add one thing, and that is, I think Farm Aid is very lucky to know a lot of the folks that are working on the ground in the organizations. And as Glenda pointed out, the Land Stewardship Project, the reason that we knew about this is because we knew them and we were in contact with them, and they were able to come to us with this moment where they suddenly needed legal support. And this has been the case often with state actions, and the state actions are often the crucial places to respond. So if any of you on this call would like ever to use us as a resource, we would be more than happy to share any information we have about where hotspots might be, where there could be the need for some rather quick legal action. And I want to emphasize also how important it is to have this structure of FLAG that exists as a place that we can go to, because without it, there really would be no kind of skeleton of what we all need to have as a place with information, with all kinds of pockets of information and ability to respond directly with people. And I also want to thank everybody because, again, I just want to emphasize this moment in history is a moment where we're faced with so much misinformation. And I know everybody's looking at how can we get real information to people. And I think if we use this web of grassroots organizations that exist, I think that we are lucky that these exist and that we can be in touch with them and support them.
Thanks, Carolyn. And now one quick last final closing thought from you, Sarah.
I would like to echo the urgency that Carolyn alluded to, which is the misinformation. You know, the posse comitatus, it uses different names today, but they're back called the constitutional sheriffs or this or that. But they're recruiting and they're using allegations of theft of land and distrust and disinformation as recruiting, and people who are suffering, people who don't see help coming from standard society, from Congress, from elected officials, from the county government, will turn to get help wherever they can. And oftentimes that so-called help is going to drag them down even further, conceivably get them into legal trouble, conceivably cause their death. I spent a lot of time in the 80s fighting against the posse comitatus and all of that. And the response has to be that standard society stands up for people who are facing forces that they can't control. And I'm really proud to be a member of the Sustainable Food and Agriculture System Funders. I'm finally getting the name down. The abbreviation I use most of the time is sassafras. It's easier. But to me, this organization is a dream come true. Funders who care about farmers, funders who care about food systems. So I really wish everybody the best, and I'm grateful for all the years I've been able to work alongside FLAG and Farm Aid. FLAG, by the way, did the training for our claims people who worked in the Keeps Eagle case, and they were also an expert for us on how discrimination works in the great big monster huge Keeps Eagle litigation that I worked on for a long time too. So I'm really grateful for these organizations and for all the people who are listening, and the small and big funders. You could make the difference. You could reach a small organization that has a big problem, then that could be the difference between that organization fighting injustice or being forced to give up. So I really hope all of you will think about some of the topics we've talked about today and explore these problems. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody further if they want. And do read the book if you'd like. I wrote it for that last paragraph.
Thanks, Sarah.
Absolutely wonderful. And I hope it's a movie, Sarah. I hope it's a movie someday.
Thanks all. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, Glenda and Stephen. It's been wonderful to work with you all and really appreciate the insights that you brought to our audience. We do encourage you all to come to the SAFSF Forum in Kansas City next month. If you have any questions about the program or our COVID protocols, feel free to reach out to me or to my colleague, Erin. And I put the link into the chat. Registration does close on June 8th. And I know that Sarah and Glenda will be with us in Kansas City, so there will be another opportunity to connect with them there. With that, I'm going to close us all out, and we hope to see you in Kansas City next month. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.